Traders, how are you? With Marcello, founder of the Day Trading Academy. Today we're doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week and also things like a second assassination, blah, 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 tongue twister against Trump, the first private spacewalk in space because, you know, the Earth is flat. And also we have news on the inflation front with a lot of companies announcing huge layoffs. Let's go ahead and get started. Overall, we had pretty much seesaw markets in the United States with the stock markets. All of them were positive in the United States. You know, we had a little bit of a run, a little bit of a dip, but at the end of the week, all of them ended up positive. The Communist Republic of Canada went up more than 3% in their stock market. And one of the biggest pieces of news that we had this week was the core inflation, which is basically inflation where they strip out things like energy and food and these kinds of things, where basically it just doesn't mean anything. But that's what the primary number that they look at in the Fed, which is the central bank in the United States. It did unexpectedly tick up in August. Tongue twister again. Remember that the interest rates are the most important thing when it comes to the economy in the United States and most other major economies around the world as well. The economy in the United States is based on almost 70% of consumer spending. So you going out, buying a chocolate, buying a car, buying a mortgage. And we've been in this situation since 2008 and 2009, where we had the financial crash, which some of you may be too young to remember, but the interest rates were dropped to the lowest level in history of the world, not the history of the United States, but the history of the world, to spur the economy. So we've had this, 2 decades, basically 2010 until now, almost 25 years of record low interest rates where you've been able to afford everything because there's been a huge bubble creating, right? If the interest rate's at 2 or 3%, when I buy a house, I can buy 2 or 3 houses rather than just one, right? And so there's an expectation now that this coming week on Wednesday, when they announce the interest rate, there's going to be a cut. That's going to affect quite a bit of things. And if they do decide to cut, because they have an election to win, it doesn't matter what party's in power. Obviously, the party in power wants to keep staying in power. But that'll affect quite a bit the economy because almost 70% of the economy in the United States is consumer spending, which is based mostly on interest rates. Places like Germany, for example, almost 50%. Japan, fourth largest economy in the world, is almost 50%. United Kingdom, I haven't looked up the number, but I would bet to say it's about 50% as well. They don't spend as much as Americans, but obviously they still do spend. Overseas market news, the European markets were mostly higher for the week. Spain, positive over 3%, biggest of all. In Latin America, the markets were mostly higher. The Merval in Argentina went up by over 5.57%. In Argentina, the new government of Milei, which is he calls himself a libertarian. They've been voting socialist practically for the majority of the last 70 years. The inflation rate went down, the official numbers went down from 25% to about 3 or so percent, which is basically the difference between letting free capital markets work rather than having the government control them. I think part of the reason why we have so many issues now, especially in the US, is because we don't live in a capitalist society. You think, for example, when the Warner Brothers invented the airplane, do you think you could do that now? Like fly a plane through restricted airspace where you need permission for all kinds of stuff, even drones now. There's cities that are blocking off areas and the drones can't fly into them and things like that. So we don't live in a capitalist society anymore. We live in more a socialist society, right? Where the government controls things. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about socialism and capitalism. I did mention Latin American markets, Africa and the Middle East, mostly mixed. Saudi Arabia was the biggest loser there. Asia and Australia was mixed as well. Singapore was the biggest winner there. The whole, Asia, the East, Australia, all that area was mixed. Bitcoin and crypto, not a whole lot of news in the Bitcoin space. There really hasn't been for quite some time. For the week, however, Bitcoin did surpass 60,000 again. It went up 10%, over 10%, which for Bitcoin isn't necessarily that big of a move. Commodities and energy. Oil had its worst week in almost a year, which is good for you and I, because if oil goes down, that means that things get cheaper because everything is transported with oil. I'll give you an example. Here in Colombia, before you were able to find a round trip ticket for $300, $400. Now it's 900, 600, 700. And obviously that affects everything, right? And then that's not just flights, but I think you understand what I mean. Crude for the United States went up almost 1.50%, 68.65. International crude, which is called Brent, went up 0.77% to just a touch over $71. Precious metals were rallying quite a bit on Friday with the expectation that the central bank in the United States is going to cut rates. Remember that the United States is still the largest economy in the world, and by far. It's about 15% or so of the world economy. But most of the materials, raw materials, which are called commodities, everything from wheat to grain to soy, corn, gold, silver, oil, most stuff is primarily priced in dollars. So if the central bank in the United States lowers the interest rates, what that means is that the demand for the dollar goes down, which means that the value of the dollar goes down, which means that the value of commodities go up because they have an inverse relationship. Because if the value of the dollar goes down, that means the commodity prices go up, right? I think I explained that pretty well. So keep that in mind. If they do cut rates this week, we'll probably see the dollar go down a little bit, and then we'll see everything else go up. Gold went up 3.22% for the week. It hit another record high, just a touch under 2,600 for the week. Silver went up over 10% to $30.85. And the state of New Jersey eliminated taxes on gold and silver. Remember that we've been on this system of money where, you just have like this piece of paper, for example. This could be a US dollar for all I know, right? And the only reason why this has value, it's not backed by anything, is because you and I give it value. You and I say, well, this is what, I'm going to respect that value, and we trade with this. Way before that, for thousands of years, money was actually gold and silver. So keep that in mind. Financial and banking news. Bolivia, the country in South America, their inflation rate hit the highest level in 10 years, hit a 12-month high of 5.19%, the highest inflation in a decade. Argentina's monthly inflation, which is the government statistic rate of 25%, is now down to 3.9%. The actual inflation rate was probably somewhere around 100% because everybody was trading money in the black market. German inflation, remember, Germany is still the third largest economy in the world. They just surpassed Japan, the largest economy in Europe. Their inflation fell to the lowest rate in the last 3 years in August. And the ECB, which is the European Central Bank, cut interest rates again by 0.25% to 3.50 due to the fact that inflation is getting close to the target of 2%. Although the EU economy as a whole is skirting a recession, so they're not doing that well at all. Japan quarter two economy came in at 2.9% on an annualized basis, less than expected. They had lower than expected private consumption and capital spending in the country. Remember that they have about almost 50% consumer spending as well, and when it comes to their percentage of the economy. Political news, as I mentioned, a second assassination attempt against Trump. There was an active shooter on the golf course. This is going to continue to happen. I think there are going to be other attempts as well just before the election. 2 illegal Honduran migrants in Nebraska were arrested after they shot a bald eagle and planned to cook and eat it, which are some of the topics that have been running around on social media in regards to some of the migrants doing things to dogs and cats, especially in Ohio. And the FBI statistics came out in regards to the crime in the country. Violent crime is up about 40%. Rape is unfortunately up 42%. Aggravated assaults up 55%. All these are going to be up. Violent crime with a weapon up 56%. Violent attacks against strangers is 61%. Car theft is up 42%, and most serious forms of violent crime are up 55% since 2020, since the pandemic. And the Venezuelan opposition president candidate Edmundo Gonzalez was permitted to leave the country after authorities issued a arrest warrant for conspiracy and other crimes. He's now in Spain. Remember, they have a socialist government as well, one of the most prosperous countries in the world. They have the largest oil reserves in the world as well. But God forbid they don't vote for, well, that's what happens when you vote for socialism. Once they get into power, they don't want to let it go. Corporate news, Samsung, the huge technological conglomerate, is deciding to slash their workforce by up to 30% amid intense competition from Huawei and Apple. I don't know if you guys saw Huawei, which is the Chinese technology company, now has a phone that flips 3 times, $2,800 for the phone. BMW went down by 11%, the worst day in more than 4 years after they announced that their profit margins are going to be less than what they expected due to the sluggish demand in China. Toyota is looking to slash their production of electric vehicles as well due to the fact that demand is down across the board, not only for Toyota. Remember that Toyota is the largest manufacturer of cars in the world. It's the latest company to roll back the production of the EV cars as demand is continuing to fall. Global EV sales went up by 20% in the first half of 2024 compared to last year. Europe, for example, only went up about 1%. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, they had revenue of $7.8 billion in the month of August, 33% year over year increase, even though they dropped a little bit from last month. And Boeing, to add on top of all of their problems, they now have a union strike that's been approved. Their labor contract has been denied by the union workers. So as they're continuing to try to recover their reputation because of all the faulty parts and, I think, sabotage against the company, now they have a union strike on their hands. Ally Financial, you guys may not have heard the name of this bank, but they do mostly, financial products, loans, things like that. They're one of the largest banks in the United States. They have stated that they are seeing a surge in delinquency of loans and charge-offs. So if one of the largest banks in the world in the United States, excuse me, I said that completely backwards. One of the largest banks in the United States is saying that consumers are not paying their loans as much anymore, right? That means that the consumer in the United States isn't doing well, which means that almost 70% of the economy in the United States is not doing well. Big Lots, they have filed for bankruptcy. Big Lots is kind of like a lower end, lower price kind of big store like Kmart or a little bit smaller than a Walmart. They're deciding to close 1,400 stores, and the retail apocalypse that's happening in the United States. And Nvidia surges more than 10% between Wednesday and Thursday after the CEO stated that there's still quite a bit of demand for the chips that they produce, which are primarily for artificial intelligence. Stock is up 143% in 2024 so far. SpaceX, the Elon Musk's space company, they made the first private spacewalk on Thursday with 2 astronauts, 1 billionaire, and an engineer. So we'll have to ask them if the Earth is actually flat or not. And they have a new line of spacesuits. It took about 10 minutes outside of the capsule, and it took about just under 2 hours for the entire trip, going up, doing the walk, coming back down. And in investment news, South America's Paraguay River, which is a key source of grains just below the capital of Paraguay, which is called Asunción, breaking a record low in 2000. The river hit a record low. The record low was hit in 2021, and now it just hit another record low. Remember, when they say record low, they try to scandalize it, but remember that they've only been taking levels of the water and the climate and all these things for the last 50, maybe 70 years or so. So even when they say record cold or record hot, remember that, I'll give you an example. In Germany, when the Rhine River went down to record low levels, and the rocks, there was things written saying if the water gets this low, panic because there's a problem, with a drought. And they had one, 500 years ago. So keep that in mind when they try to scandalize all these news. Bolivia has a state of emergency, the country in South America, due to the worst forest fires in the last 10 years. An interesting fact also, Poland's longest river, the Vistula, has also fallen to a record low. They say on record, but again, remember, the German Rhine River went to a record low, and then there were writings on the rocks talking about how, it's already happened before, basically. That's your news for this week, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe. And remember, the preppers were right.